Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Benjamin Hoy. He is an associate professor of history and the director of the Historical GIS Lab at the University of Saskatchewan. His first book, A Line of Blood and Dirt, Creating the Canada-United States Border Across Indigenous Lands, examines the creation and enforcement of the Canadian-United States border between 1776 and 1939, and its impacts on the Indigenous residents whose land the border was created across. Please help me welcome Dr. Benjamin Hoy.
Miigwech, and thank you for the kind introductions. It is an honor to be asked to speak today and to share some of my thoughts around Indigenous history and the hidden parts of Canada's past. I wanted to focus the time I have with you today on the role that Indigenous people played in the creation of the Canada-US border and some of the legacies that came from that process. I think this story is important for two reasons. First, Canada as a nation would not exist in any sort of recognizable form today without the border creation process I'm going to describe. National borders serve as the basic divisions in our world and operate as the precursors to the treaty process with Indigenous people, which will serve as the basis of landholding across most of North America. Now, you may have heard the phrase, "we are all treaty people" before, and although treaties are misunderstood today, they define far more about your life than you might imagine. The phrase emphasizes the ways that treaties connect us together, not simply in the past, but through our contemporary societies as well. For those of you who own property in Saskatoon, for example, you are participating in the Treaty 6 process, something that began long before you were born, and which will continue to be relevant for you long after you die. What is often misunderstood about treaties is that they are not one-time transactions that exist in some kind of forgettable past. They are ongoing agreements and relationships that convey a continued set of responsibilities and benefits. So borders matter. They matter in part because they facilitate the treaty process that will come. The second reason I want to talk today about the creation of the Canada-US border and its relationship with Indigenous people is that in 2 weeks' time we'll be celebrating Canada's birthday. While we often pay lip service to the importance of Indigenous people in this country's creation, I'm hoping the account that I'm providing you with today will give you some more concrete examples of this. Canada is built on Indigenous lands, and it is built with Indigenous labor. And my hope is that by understanding this history, you'll begin to understand why Indigenous people, who helped create this nation only to be abandoned by it immediately thereafter, continue to press Canada to honor its treaty obligations. Or to be blunt, Indigenous people have held up their bargain for 100 years, hundreds of years. Canada and the United States, to this day, have not. This is a picture of what the border looked like in the 19th century, right? Vast amounts of open space with a border marked by a handful of stones. And as you can imagine, the Canada-US border, certainly in its infancy as well as today, grew as a complicated creature. The international agreements that created its shape were signed over more than a century ago, and it took almost an entire century for either country to mark the border on the land itself. Now, if diplomats and politicians imagined creating a border that would help gain control over a continent, the actual surveying process suggested something else entirely. Canada, the United States, and Britain had set out to create a border that all but ignored Indigenous people. In the process, though, they soon found their own reliance on them. Indigenous people supplied 3 key ingredients necessary for the border's creation: labor, knowledge, and memory. Now, as silly as this sounds, despite expending enormous amounts of money creating treaties and maps and thousands of pages of documentation, Canada and the United States often knew almost nothing about the territory they claimed. And when they did have information, the information they had often conflicted with one another. In practice, this forced Canada and the United States to enlist Indigenous elders to clarify parts of the border. And the St. Croix River, which is located around Maine, New Brunswick on sort of the eastern seaboard, is one example of this. The French, who arrived in this region and who had created a lot of the maps and documentation around which the border would be eventually created around, had this really awful habit of naming many of the rivers they came across the St. Croix River. And so that becomes the sort of basis of the boundary. It's going to follow this river. But which one of 100 rivers does this refer to? So unable to sort of resolve this on their own, they'll turn, Canadian and American surveyors will turn to Passamaquoddy elders to help clarify the border's path along the seaboard. That is, individuals who weren't part of the initial agreements, who are excluded from the border's agreements, are actually key members to clarifying how this border will play out in practice. And in the prairies, similar sets of challenges emerged. In the 1870s, surveyors set out to find a key reference monument their government had placed in the Lake of the Woods in the 1820s. And this monument's precise location mattered a lot. It mattered because its location would determine whether Manitoba would lose its most direct means of communication with the rest of the country, or not. And try as they might, they spent quite a bit of effort trying to find this monument. British and American officials could not find a monument their governments had placed only a few decades earlier. And that is perhaps understandable. As this image suggests, the Lake of the Woods, it was a complex body of water consisting of an endless array of bays and islands and inlets. And to make matters worse, fire had swept through the region between the two survey parties, and all that remained of the monument was a charred oak log underwater and embedded in soil. The team discovered the monument only with the help of an old Ojibwe man who's left unnamed, whose knowledge of the area and the previous survey would prove invaluable. Indigenous labor, much like Indigenous knowledge, underwrote many of these early surveys. Henry Custer, one of the team's topographers, would employ Indigenous guides and laborers for many months. When he reflected on their service, he expressed an unreserved gratitude for their efforts, emphasizing the almost incredible amounts of labor that may be gotten out of Indigenous people when they were treated with respect. The Stalo, Semiahmoo, Lummi, Nooksack, and Colville would provide the survey teams with saddles, canoes, sleighs, planks of woods, and a wide array of food. They would pilot steamers, ferried parties across the Chilliwack River, cared for animals, rented out their cabins, and served as guides. Métis scouts, pictured here, served as diplomats across the prairie, smoothing out relations with other groups whose lands the surveyors entered. Indigenous labor was so important to the surveyors' success that the surveyors encouraged Indigenous families to camp around them, supplying those who remained with flour and bacon. And this beautiful watercolor, which was created by Donald Roderick Cameron, who's the superintendent of the Boundary Commission in the Prairies, gives you a small taste of this. In this drawing, the Boundary Commission's camps are filled with Indigenous children, emphasizing the close connection surveyors needed to make with the communities around them in order to secure access to knowledge and labor. If Indigenous people built Canada's borders and supported many of its early industries, and were good hosts to the newcomers they encountered, that generosity was not reciprocated. By the 20th century, disease, starvation, and immigration had remade the continent. In the process, federal administrators transformed the border into a barrier to Indigenous movement and into a means to curtail many of their cultural practices. Two Voices, an Ojibwe living in the United States, traveled to Canada as an old man. When he attempted to return to the United States, American immigration officials prohibited his re-entry on an account of an eye disease that they believed he picked up. At the time of Two Voices' interview with anthropologist Mandelbaum, D.G. Mandelbaum, in 1934, Two Voices had not succeeded in returning to the United States. At the time, he was estimated to be over 105 years old, and he faced a decision at the border that likely prevented him from returning home for the rest of his life. Two Voices was not alone. In 1921, the Six Nations Council sent Duskahay, also known as Levi General, a Cayuga chief born on Six Nations Reserve in Garden River, Ontario, not far from where I grew up, all the way to England. Traveling on a Haudenosaunee passport, Desgahe argued that the Haudenosaunee had a fundamental right to self-governance. Britain and Canada undermined his diplomatic efforts and would attempt to punish him in all sorts of different ways, including trying to auction off his property for his defiance while he was away from home. Desgahe would turn to his friends south of the border for support. While he remained there, immigration agents prevented visitors, family members, and medicine men from crossing the line to see him, hoping that the tight border enforcement would limit his growing influence. On March 10, 1925, Desgahe made his last speech. He condemned Canada and the United States for failing to keep treaty promises, for their false accounting, for their abuse of Indian policy, and for their insatiable demand for land. He accused both countries of forming, in his words, a silent partnership of policy to dominate every acre of Indigenous peoples' territory. He chastised them for hiding their imperialism behind the rule of law, rather than doing away with pretenses and subjugating us to your will. Desgahe's speech ended with a plea for the future and a reflection on the past. He hoped the Haudenosaunee would remain together, resist assimilation, and would help thwart colonial attempts to grant them citizenship. Should they fail to do so, their communities would be torn apart, and they would be forced to drift to the cities. At this point, he believed the Haudenosaunee would be no more. At the same moment, he asked American and Canadians to reflect upon their own history. If the Haudenosaunee had not helped the British during the 7 Years' War, France would not have succeeded in driving the English from the continent. Desgahe's experience in Geneva, his attempts to visit the UN, would temper his optimism. Still, he hoped that his speech and his broader work would one day find those who had not been listening. He would die June 27, 1925, of pleurisy and pneumonia. The Garden River and Tuscarora communities viewed his death as an avoidable tragedy. Had federal officials allowed their medicine men to visit him, perhaps he would have lived. The Canada-US border still bears the guide marks of the 19th century. Changes in demography, technology, and political climate have altered the specifics of policy, but not always their thrust. Desgahe's experience was not some part of a forgotten past. He breathed his last breath when my grandmother was just breathing her first. The horrors facing Indigenous people would not end in either of these two generations. In the 1940s and 1950s, the Canadian government would conduct nutritional experiments on more than 1,000 Indigenous children, withholding nutrients and dental care for those who desperately needed it. In the 1960s, Canada would forcibly remove scores of Indigenous children as part of the 60s scoop. The 1970s would see Alberta sterilize at least 1,000 Indigenous women without their consent, and in many cases, without their knowledge. As this mural suggests, we have inherited this world. The borders, institutions, and policies we interact with on a daily basis were built on top of Indigenous lands. Many parts of our world were made possible by the generosity of Indigenous people, a goodwill and generosity that has rarely been extended in the opposite direction. I'm hoping that by sharing some of these stories with you today, you will better understand our shared past and begin to reimagine a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoy. Next up, we have Dr. Winona Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler is an associate professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan in the College of Arts and Science. Dr. Wheeler is a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory, Manitoba, and her family comes from the George Gordon First Nation in Treaty 4 territory, Saskatchewan. A lifelong student of Indigenous knowledge and history, Winona has been teaching and publishing in Indigenous studies since 1988. Her areas of research are Indigenous oral histories, Indigenous local histories, land claims and treaty rights, and settler colonialism. She is a mother and grandmother and lives in a little ranch in the traditional lands of the Willow Creek in Treaty 6 territory, with her horses, dogs, cats, rabbits, and quails. Welcome, Dr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Angela. Danse Antawal. I shake hands with each and every one of you, and I thank Dr. James for setting up this panel on this really special day. I speak to you from the land of the Willow Cree in Treaty 6 territory, a few miles from the original Métis town of Duck Lake, where the first military engagement of what came to be called the Northwest Rebellion occurred in March of 1885. I have no immediate relatives here as my people come from down south, but I do through marriage, and so I've been welcomed in this country here. So since the recent news of the 215 little graves found on the old Kamloops Indian residential school grounds, there's finally been enough public outrage that the federal government just may agree to scan the grounds of all former Indian residential schools to find other little ones who were not returned home. Many years ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission requested the federal government to do this, but the request was rejected because the $1.5 million price tag was considered too much. So many children died in those institutions, and none, except those who came from the local area, were returned to their families for burial. Families were simply told your child died, most often not being told the cause of death or where their children were buried. Their bodies were not returned home because it was considered too expensive. We don't know the exact number of children who died at the residential schools and probably never will. But with political pressure, we can at least push government to locate the bodies that remain and try to identify them so families can have some closure. We also do not know how many local children were sent home to die. My late Uncle Bernard was sent home at 12 years of age when he contracted typhoid fever at Gordon's residential school. When he arrived home, my late grandmother bathed him and doctored him to the best of her ability, but he passed away a few weeks later. She told us his story many times about how he was dropped off at the house and that his ears were scarred and scabby and torn from having been violently yanked over and over again. On his deathbed, he made my grandparents promise they would not let them take his little sisters. And so my family ran away from their home in the Touchwood Hills in present-day Saskatchewan, all the way to Churchill, Manitoba. My grandparents, aunts, uncles never got over the trauma of Uncle Bernard's death. There were no records stating he was sent home to die, merely that he was discharged. When the news of the 215 graves at Kamloops went public, so many of our people felt it deeply. Many were triggered. Most felt some relief that their family stories about missing children, their truths, might now be believed. Because until our truths, the truths that still impact our daily lives and have shaped Indigenous settler relations to this day, until our truths are public and accepted, there will never be enough trust on this side, or enough awareness, open-mindedness, and willingness to make change among others. And without that trust, there will never be conciliation. The treatment of Indigenous children at the residential schools has been so ignored or so normalized that until the Truth and Reconciliation Inquiry and reports, very few non-Indigenous people even questioned why there were graveyards at those schools. I mean, how many other schools in present-day Canada, besides orphanages, have graveyards? Schools are not supposed to have graveyards. So there's a lot of books out now, there's a lot of reports, articles, film documentaries on the history of the residential school system. For the rest of my time, I'm going to share a little bit about the education that our people envisioned, what we got instead, and that we've been fighting this battle a long, long time. Next slide, please, Vanessa. So long before Western education was introduced here, my people's education was a lifelong pursuit built on knowledge passed down, research, experimentation, and long before it was a thing in universities, experiential and community service learning. Everyone had access to knowledge and skills, but it was not free for the taking. Knowledge transmission was based on relationships and reciprocity, and specialized kinds of knowledge was acquired through apprenticeship. The history of Indigenous peoples in Western education goes way back to the 1820s in present-day Western Canada, but for brevity, I'll pick it up I'll pick up the story at treaty time. Next slide, please, Vanessa. By the time treaty came to our territories in the 1870s, our people already knew about Western schoolhouses, trades, and professions. The first mission school was created in 1820, and my great-great-grandfather, Esquinotau, who was renamed Charles Pratt, attended there for 8 years. By 1870, there were mission schools set up at Fort Pelly, Mission Lake, Fort Capel, La Pas, Cumberland House, Isle Cross, Touchwood Hills. There was a few of them. So when treaties were negotiated, the Crown accepted responsibility for providing Western education. Next slide, please, Vanessa. At Treaty 4, Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris stated, and I'm quoting here, "The promises we have to make to you are not for today only, but for tomorrow. Not only for you, but for your children born and unborn. And the promises we make will be carried out as long as the sun shines above and the water flows in the ocean. The Queen wishes her red children to learn the cunning of the white man. And when they are ready for it, she will send schoolmasters on every reserve and pay them." There were no other stipulations in the treaties, but First Nations were assured that there was no need for any further stipulations because it was the policy of the government to provide in every part of the country for the education of Indian children. But there were a lot of verbal promises. Our people understood that they would be getting reserve day schools. However, they pressed the treaty commissioner about the kind of education and training they wanted. And oral history tells us that Governor Morris responded by standing up and waving his hand behind him and pointing to all the staff members of the Treaty Commission. And he told the people that they'll have the same education as all of those you see here. The Treaty Commission staff included military personnel, ministers, lawyers, clerks, teachers, and others who had training over and above elementary school, surveyors, the works. So it was that our people came to believe what they were told, that the treaty right to education included elementary, high school, and post-secondary. We now know that the federal government has interpreted the education provision literally and narrowly, that their position is that they're only obligated to provide elementary education. The federal government continues to argue that they only provide high school and post-secondary support funding as a matter of social policy, not treaty rights. We also believed that the Western education that was being offered would augment our traditional education, that it was over and above our own ways of life. We never anticipated that it would intentionally replace what we already had. And there was absolutely no discussion of residential schools or compulsory education. Education was to be provided when the communities were ready for them and wanted them. So while the treaties are being negotiated on a nation-to-nation basis in the 1870s, the federal government consolidated the Indian Act in 1876, which discursively and legally transformed independent First Nations peoples into wards of the Crown, and this was done behind closed doors. Federal policy was always about assimilation, and education was viewed as the most important tool of assimilation. Indigenous peoples were considered useless and in the way of progress in their minds, meaning settlement, farming, resource development, the building of cities and centers of manufacturing, industry and trade, obstacles to the spread of quote unquote civilization. On reserve day schools, however, soon after they were set up, it was determined that they were not producing the results intended. So the Indian Residential School was created. The best way they believed to prepare First Nations children for assimilation was to remove them from the influences of their families and communities. Their attendance there was assured and their everyday activities were monitored and regulated. And so the Indian Reserve System was supported by cost sharing between the churches and the federal government. And that included Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Methodists, and Presbyterians who are now United Church in Western Canada. And the churches were left to run the schools. This photo is really a well-known photograph. It's a picture of Thomas Moore Keesick. On August 26, 1891, 8-year-old Thomas was enrolled in the Regina Indian Industrial School along with his brother Samuel and his sister Julia. He was the 22nd student registered in the school, which operated from 1891 to 1910, and he became known as Number 22. Moore was from Muscoppeting, Soto First Nation, located 45 minutes northeast of Regina. And he was the youngest child of Paul Desjardins Sr. and Hannah Moore Kiesig. 4 years after enrolling, Moore was sent home with consumption, now known as tuberculosis, that he contracted at the residential school, and he died soon after that. So while the federal government and the churches continued to use this photograph to prove the civilizing success of industrial schools, the reality is the little boy died. Next slide, please, Vanessa. In 1894, compulsory attendance was imposed on First Nations families. So if children were withheld, their parents could be charged with a summary offense and spend up to 3 months in jail. That was tightened in 1920 with an amendment to the Indian Act, making school attendance absolutely compulsory for First Nations children under the age of 15 years. So as a result of that amendment, Indigenous enrollment rose to about 17,000 in all schools and more than 8,000 in residential schools by the 1920s. According to reports at this point, 75% of all First Nations children were enrolled in some day school or residential school. Next slide, please, Vanessa. There were many government officials and missionaries who had input into the Indian residential school system, but Duncan Campbell Scott has gained special notoriety. He was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, and he oversaw the residential school system at its peak. He was a career civil servant. He was involved in Aboriginal affairs throughout his career. He was an extreme assimilationist. When he mandated school attendance, compulsory school attendance in 1920, he stated, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question, no Indian department, and that is the whole object of this bill." Scott summarized the prevailing attitudes of Canadian officials. The First Peoples, despite many agreements with the Crown that guaranteed their independence, were to be eradicated as distinct nations and cultures. So by the turn of the 20th century, there were 18 industrial and 36 residential schools. By 1930s, at the peak of the IRS system, there were 77 state-funded residential schools in Canada. Over the 150-year period of the IRS system, Canada saw close to 150 schools and 150,000 students. Next slide, please, Vanessa. The federal government was required to provide medical services to the Indian residential schools students. Once a year, they sent out doctors to each of the residential schools to check on the health of the kids. Although medical experts such as Dr. Peter Bryce recommended measures to improve health and medical treatment, these were not implemented by the government, largely due to concerns about cost and opposition by the churches. Dr. Bryce found Duncan Campbell Scott penny pinching to be the main obstacle in promoting basic reforms that could have saved hundreds of lives, but nobody listened to him. A defeated and aging man, Bryce published a pamphlet in 1922 called The Story of a National Crime. In it, he argued that Scott in particular had consistently failed to acknowledge and address Native health needs in the schools. So we can't argue that Scott's attitude reflected everyone's opinion during that time. There were very few who challenged the racism and brutality, but their voices were silenced in the best interests of the nation. Next slide, Vanessa, please. Oh, and again. And again. I forgot those were little rolling ones. So Indigenous students and parents resisted and protested the residential schools. Some children refused to cooperate and sabotaged the operations of the kitchen or classroom. They stole food supplies, they ran away. Many died when they ran away. At least 25 residential schools were burnt down by students. Their parents and political leaders protested the school's harsh conditions and the pedagogical shortcomings, but their objections were mostly ignored. In 1948-49, the Joint Commission on Indian Affairs was created because of the dismal failure of Indian Affairs policies overall, and especially about the residential schools. Because by 1940s, it was obvious to both the government and the missionaries that the schools were ineffective, and Indigenous protests helped to secure change in policy. In 1969, the system was taken over by the federal government, ending church involvement. A few years later, 1972, the National Indian Brotherhood published its well-known statement, Indian Control of Indian Education, which was an honest critique, searing critique of the government's handling of First Nations education, and an assertion that it was time for the education of First Nations children to be taken back by communities. By 1986, most Indian residential schools had either been closed or turned over to local bands. And the last one to close was on my reserve 10 years later, Gordon's Residential School in Punachai, Saskatchewan. And here we are in 2021, still dealing with the intergenerational long-term impacts of the Indian residential school system, while many Canadians are just now learning about it. The news of the 215 graves discovered at Kamloops shocked the nation. Non-Indigenous peoples were stunned. Many went through roller coasters of emotion. Some were absolutely heartbroken, and many asked, what can we do to help? Some guiding words from one of our elders here on campus is a good place to start. Vanessa, can you get the next one, please? You cannot reconcile a relationship that never existed. I'll leave this for you to read on your own. Next slide, please, Vanessa. If you're truly serious about helping to make change, it begins with a critical assessment of the systems and the structures in existence that uphold the status quo and a willingness to make change. Many, many of our people say over and over again, guilt is useless. We don't want your guilt. We don't need you to apologize for your ancestors. We are asking you to dismantle the systems built, that they built, but that you maintain and that you benefit from. So at this point in our history, what we're talking about is gaining trust by being open and aware and receptive, and a willingness to help make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wheeler. Next up is our next speaker, Dr. Carrie Barassa. She is the scientific director of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health, and a professor, community health and epidemiology at the University of Saskatchewan. She is the principal investigator for the Canada Foundation for Innovation Funding Morningstar Lodge, as well as the Cultural Safety Evaluation Training and Research Lab. Dr. Barassa has nearly 20 years experience as a professor in the field of Indigenous health studies. Through her role as scientific director of IIPH, she leads the advancement of a national health research agenda to improve and promote the health of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. Dr. Barassa.
Annie, good afternoon. My name is Carrie Barassa. I'm the scientific director at the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health and professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology at the University of Saskatchewan and the College of Medicine. If you want to flip the slide, Brianna. I want to honor my grandfather who passed away when I was 19. I'm originally from Treaty 4 territory, and I want to acknowledge that I live in Treaty 6 territory and been very warmly welcomed by the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Nakota, Lakota, Dakota, Saulteaux, and homeland of the Métis Nation. I want to thank Dr. Winona Wheeler for inviting me to this presentation. If you want to flip the slide. So I want to talk a little bit about systemic racism and how it impacts the health of Indigenous peoples, not only the mental and emotional impacts, but also spiritual and physical impacts. So what is systemic racism? It is the policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization, and that results in the continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. It's interpersonal or relational racism that fuels the perpetuation of systemic racism. Do you want to flip this slide, please? So I don't want to go through all of this in depth, but just to say, of course, that for Indigenous people in particular, colonial policies continue to impact Indigenous people in many ways. In terms of colonization, residential schools continued to impact not only historically, but also, of course, ongoing trauma from residential schools. Of course, there was outlawing of gatherings, forced community dislocations, and discriminatory child welfare legislation as well. And that certainly continues on to present day. There's also inadequate living conditions. Indigenous peoples who live in cities often have overcrowding. That also carries over to rural and remote communities who often have inadequate housing and living conditions, mold, overcrowding. The housing doesn't have to live up to any kind of code when you're off reserve, on reserve. So these are ongoing issues. There's also limited healthy food choices, and these are connected back to residential schools where, food was rationed, there was experimentations, their traditional foods were very limited. Preservatives and sugar and all kinds of other foods were introduced into the communities. And so dispossession of traditional lands really interfered with the traditional economies and access to traditional foods. Of course, there's a dispossession of traditional lands and relocation, and of course, substandard healthcare, if any. And of course, there's perceived interpersonal racism and towards Indigenous patients through healthcare providers across healthcare settings. If you want to flip the slide. So I don't want to go through all of these. I wish we had more time, but just to say that the impact of poverty is palpable. It has impacted Indigenous peoples, and the lack of support from government programs, the social exclusion, the nutrient-dense foods, the lack of access to clean water, the lack of access to culturally safe care, the systemic racism, the barriers and gaps in care, the wait lists on reserve, the limited healthcare coverage or insurance, if any, the economic barriers, racism. You can see the picture that is being portrayed here in terms of the impacts of systemic racism on Indigenous people's health, and the underlying colonial underpinnings. If you want to flip the slide. In terms of experiences of care, Indigenous peoples often do not access healthcare because of racism, oppression, stigma, bias, and the historical legacies and the ongoing government policies that have been created that lead to inequitable access to safe care. Racism is considered a chronic stressor that is linked to the ill health of all racialized groups, and in particular Indigenous peoples. And as I said, Indigenous peoples often do not use mainstream healthcare services because of the experiences of stereotyping, discrimination, racism, etc. And in fact, in 2015, a study of 80 Indigenous women across Canada explained that racism and sexism combined to produce a lack of safe access to services in a variety of healthcare settings. And so the recommendations from these co-researchers concerned more education and awareness training, focusing on cultural safety, and this continues on to today. If you want to flip the slide. So moving forward, anti-racism is a form of action against racism, including systemic racism and the oppression of marginalized groups. This is where we have to start to talk about decolonizing anti-racism that lies at the intersection of the struggles for liberation. This includes talking about Indigenous peoples and their lands and acknowledging the need to reclaim their lands and reflecting and acknowledging the contradictions that arises in struggles stemming from a post-colonial world. Colonization continues on. It is not something in the past. And pan-indigenizing is indeed colonial. If you want to flip the slide. So healthcare and cultural safety, healthcare providers are encouraged to ask clients and family members and community members to ensure that it is communities that hold the power when it comes to healthcare. And this is a real shift. So ensuring that their experience of illness and its treatment is built on healthy relationships between patient and healthcare providers. And that is imperative to achieving cultural safety. So when healthcare providers engage with clients in this way, it can present opportunities to become Indigenous client focused. And culturally safe care requires building on trust with Indigenous clients and recognizing the role of socioeconomic conditions, history, and politics in health. And always remembering the underlying social determinants of health also includes colonization. If you want to flip the slide. So some key recommendations, solutions to restore health can be found within Indigenous peoples' resilience, cultures, spiritualities, languages, identities, holistic practices, connection to land, and of course, self-determination. And racial justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce the equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, Amnesty International, and the Sisters in Spirit campaigns have made several recommendations for action. And these include sustainable funding for culturally appropriate services, increased capacity and recruitment for Indigenous peoples, education programs that address the history of colonization, and realigning services to be more responsive for the needs of Indigenous peoples, including upholding international human rights instruments and taking a holistic approach to health. If you want to flip the slide. These are a table of recommendations, which I won't be able to go through all of these, but again, these are driven by Indigenous peoples, including ensuring that elders and advisors are upheld and our leaders learn directly from Indigenous communities, seek out advice from elders and advisors, train and hire Indigenous peoples, ensure equal power sharing and research decision making, restructure research laboratories to ensure that Indigenous research philosophies and methodologies are invoked. You know, again, this is all about ensuring that Indigenous peoples are leading research agendas, and that power is in the hands of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Dr. Barassa. Again, just to reiterate, the panel spoke a lot about what it means for conciliation, the trust that has to happen and to be part of the conversation between settler and Indigenous peoples, and the truths that need to be recognized and acknowledged before we can move towards conciliation. So we'll open up the time for question and answer. If you have a question, please put it in the chat line and I will monitor that while our speakers then answer the questions. Lots of thank yous from the participants, our audience thanking the presentation. I think maybe I'll ask a first question and then that might help generate, or people are typing in. So you each spoke about the historical aspect and then and how that impacts current day relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. In what ways can we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Council's call to actions? It's one of the parts of this day that we've arts and science, the arts galleries, and the School of Medicine are projecting those calls to action onto the buildings. So if you're out and about on campus over the course of this next week, please walk through it. They're better seen during the evening time or at night. But those calls to actions, how can, in what you all have spoken about today, how can those calls to action become more of a priority for us in addressing the needs of our Indigenous peoples today? Anybody want to start?
Sure, I guess I'll start it off. You know, one of the sort of depressing things about being a historian amongst, you know, what Dr. Wheeler and others have talked about is this is not the first time similar calls have been made. You know, in my father's generation, there was the Royal Commission on Indigenous People. And as Winona mentioned, you know, this goes back to the 1920s and then the 1880s. You know, these calls keep coming and keep going unanswered. So, you know, if this is the first time that you've heard this is not the first time Indigenous people have made similar calls, or that the government has recognized wrongdoing, or that something serious needed to change. You know, so I think some of this is, you know, taking it more seriously, that, you know, if you want to see change, it has to be change that you yourself help to bring about. That it's not enough to make these calls because they've been made, you know, every 20 years for the last 100 years.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hoy. Dr. Wheeler, Dr. Barassa.
One of the things that we're constantly up against, and even in our own university, is when we're trying to make change and we bring up things that have impacted us, we're told that's in the past, move on. Well, unless you've experienced intergenerational trauma, you're asking for a miracle, because intergenerational trauma is real and it affects every single one of us. I mean, I'm one generation removed from residential schools. My two older cousins went. They cut it off at the cousin that was older than me. My children are impacted, my grandchildren and my upcoming great-grandchildren. So having to carry that is a huge burden. And it's not like you would say, okay, veterans, the wars are done, forget about it, right? Move on. We don't need to celebrate Veterans Day. We don't need to commemorate, the fallen victims of the Holocaust. 9/11 victims, we don't have to commemorate them. Let's all move on. That would never be acceptable in mainstream society, but we're expected to forget about it, pull up our bootstraps and move on. And I think that's really a hard thing for me to deal with on a daily level in the classroom and on campus and in mainstream in general. And I think the other thing that's really important is that the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are for systemic and structural change. And mainstream institutions, mainstream governments, they don't do that very good. They like to have symbols. They like to have music. They like to have art. They like to have stories. But damn, they don't like to change the way they do things. Right? The challenge of changing processes, changing systems, changing structures to accommodate difference is really hard for them. And I think that's where we need the change to happen, because otherwise things just remain the same.
Dr. Barassa, did you want to address the question? We also have one more in the chat line. But you're on mute.
I always do that. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Wheeler, and we have made some pretty remarkable strides at CHR, believe it or not, when it comes to systemic issues. And it's not, we're not there yet, but we have made some pretty good changes. But every time you make some good changes, then anything substantial, there's usually, it's kind of like the shoe's going to drop, right? Because anytime there is something that goes well and you're like, oh wow, something is good is happening, there's usually some kind of backlash, something, somebody doesn't like something, or somebody, something internal, somebody's been there for 20 years, usually, there's some middle managers, something happens, right? It's inevitable. And so it's so difficult. We can talk about decolonization, we can talk about alignment with UNDRIP, we can talk about, and you get some momentum and, poof, something happens. It's so difficult. It's so difficult to make meaningful change in any, whether it's academia, whether it's in, in larger institutions, even in our own institutions, even at First Nations University, it's very, very difficult to have sustainable change. And it doesn't, it doesn't mean that we stop. It's just the reality. And I guess just, trying to, continue and try to get the right people and continue on. And, we can't give up, but it is very difficult to not only, create systemic change, but to have it sustained, have a sustainable, change that won't sort of take 10 steps back.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question from Aaron Barber Tuck. Elder Maria Campbell said that giving back the land would be a good start to conciliation. What would this actually look like?
I'll take that one on. to start. The whole land back movement that you've been hearing about in the press lately is way more than just land. It's all encompassing. It's about way of life. It's about all those things in life that make your life healthy and fulfilling. It's about, because in our worlds, the land is life, right? So when we're talking about land, we're talking about a whole lot of other things too. We're talking about clean waters on our reserves. My God, if there was a small town or a city in Canada that had bad water, I mean, people would be jumping on that in an instant, right? But how many reserves do we have in Canada that have been on boil water advisories for 20 or 30 years? Where's the political will and the support to get decent water to communities? It's about traditional territorial lands that are now deemed crown lands, where we still have a stake, because according to our treaties and our understanding of the treaties, we never gave up, ceded, or surrendered all those lands. According to our oral histories, we agreed to share it. We agreed to share the land, not to give it up. And my great-great-grandfather was interpreter for Treaty Number 4, and he said, to the depth of a plow. That's what we agreed to share. And so we have an interest and a really strong connection to our traditional territories. And so when you see activities going on like rabid resource exploitation, and you see Indigenous peoples out on the roads blocking them and trying to stop deforestation, understand where they're coming from. They're trying to protect the land. Get out there and help them. So it's more than just buying a piece of land and handing it over to somebody. It's about the land. It's about life. It's about protecting life. It's so all inclusive. And there's so many ways that people can help out in that regard. I know in some instances there's people who have large tracts of land have been in their wills, passing them over to people, to communities, and that's really awesome. But that's little bits of land. We're talking huge territories here that still need protecting. Understand where we're coming from when we're trying to protect the land, when we're trying to promote renewable resource use, renewable energy, as opposed to non-renewable resource use, that's exploiting the land and destroying it. All the ways that we try to work to protect the land. That's all part of it. I'm sure Ben and Carrie can carry on with that.
Just quickly jump in to clarify that land is not money. I think one of the sort of big pieces is, trying to get land claims cases where, a financial settlement is made. But for many communities like the Stalo or the Coast Salish, right, your stories are tied to your land, right? And without that land, you don't have your stories. And without those stories, you don't have your culture. And you can see how insistent groups like the Assedi-Sakowin or the Sioux are, where they still will not take the money that was set aside for the Black Hills, which they consider was a theft. And that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars now, because land is not money. So the push for land specifically is intentional. It's not an ask for resources. It's not an ask for support. It's asking for the basic building blocks of a nation.
And one more point about land claims, because I'm a land claims researcher. Thanks, Ben. It takes so long to get through the land claims process, the specific claims tribunal process. We started a land claim on my reserve in 1991. We just got a settlement this year. That's how long the process takes. That's government bureaucracy, clearly in place not to help, not to promote, not to reach conciliation. So put pressure on the governments to deal with the land claims, the outstanding land claims, instead of fighting them all the time because they lose.
And I would just reiterate it, it's always on the burden of the Indigenous people to prove and to fight that, and financially the burden. We have another question. What kind of action can we take here at the university to create change in a good way? And then we have a question directed at Ben Hoy after this one.
I guess I can start with this first one. I think there's lots of different ways, and there's people much more knowledgeable than me to speak to this. But I think one thing that the college did, I think, a reasonably good job of initially was hiring people with the knowledge to make this kind of change and maintaining some of that hiring practice through tough times, setting aside specific positions to hire Indigenous people. And I think that the challenge that the college is facing, specifically in the university more generally, is that it hasn't kept hardly any of these people. That is, it's not enough just to hire people. You have to retain them. You have to support them. You have to create an environment in which they'll flourish. And I think that's one of the most pressing issues facing the college and the university today is it's easy to hire Indigenous faculty. But as it turns out, supporting them is been quite a challenge.
And I think that's a systemic issue. And the university follows its regular guidelines on hiring, follows its regular guidelines when it's dealing with Indigenous hires, and it just doesn't work very good. It doesn't work. You got to be flexible. And there's all sorts of precedents. And I'll just give you one example. I mean, the U of S 10 years ago was crying because they couldn't hire Indigenous people because there weren't enough Indigenous PhDs out there. So that's why they couldn't hire very many. Well, at the same time, over at First Nations University, we hire people with master's degrees, not even ABD'd. We'd hire them with master's degrees and provide them 90% of their salary to go and get their coursework done and provide all of these supports. We created PhDs. And in a very short time, we created how many, Carrie? We created about 14, 15 PhDs within about a 6-year period, including Sherry Farrell-Rissette, Carrie, myself, others. They put their money where their mouth was, and they created the PhDs that they needed. Not put them on term appointments where they're struggling to teach 5 classes and finish their dissertations, tenure track, right? And nurture them along, help them along. Hiring local people, because local people are committed to the territory. They stay, they bring their families. There's all sorts of things that can be done. And I think it's really important that instead of trying to figure out how to make change from above, consult with people, talk to people. What would bring more Indigenous scholars here? What would it take to keep Indigenous scholars here? What can we do to change the system to accommodate?
Sorry, I probably shouldn't even say this, but so with my mentorship lab, I'm pretty much doing this, what we did at First Nations University, because there's these, these young people who want to do a PhD, want to do a master's, but the University of Saskatchewan makes it so difficult. So I basically do what I can to circumvent it. And, we have in our lab, we use a mentorship lens, and we have, I think I've got 12 students. Now, not all of them want to go and get a master's or PhD, but just being in the lab, and we have everyone from community researchers in the lab and partnerships, through the various First Nations in Saskatchewan. And then some of them decide, hey, you know what? I think I want to, go get a master's degree, or I want to, go and do a PhD. And so then, they work in the lab at the same time that they decide that they want to, go into a PhD or master's or whatever. And some want to go into medicine, but we use that same model, right, to build, the capacity so that they can decide what they want to do. But they make it so hard at the University of Saskatchewan, very, very hard. So we dance around and we do whatever we can do so that we can keep them and they can eventually get into a program, but it is very hard. They make it as hard as possible. We're constantly fighting with the University of Saskatchewan, and it's difficult. It's very difficult, as you just said. It's almost like there's barriers put up. If we could just, use the model that we had at the university, at First Nations University, we'd have tons of Indigenous people that were happy and satisfied. Like, how many people have left the University of Saskatchewan in the last several months? a lot of people have left.
Thank you. We're coming down to the very end of our panel discussion. We still have a couple other questions, one of which I think, Ben, I'm going to turn that over to you to answer, Christina Fiddler, maybe directly through an email or such. We also had a question about Bill C-15 provisions of UNDRIP and reactions that the panel might have. Some comments about directed at Carrie's last comment about it's not even just master's and PhD students, but it's also just getting Indigenous students enrolled and sort of tearing down those barriers for their undergraduate. And so I think there is a lot of work left to do. We've not even scratched the surface. And I think that these kinds of conversations need to continue to happen in smaller and bigger venues. So we're going to work on doing that over the course of the next year for sure. I want to thank the presenters for coming together in such a quick manner and answering my call for help to put a panel together. You all have done a wonderful job. Your expertise is so valued here. I value your expertise and your knowledge, your stories. I really appreciate you taking the time today to do this work. I think that even if it's only a few people who walk away with more knowledge and a better understanding, then that's a win. That's a victory for all of us. So thank you so much for your time today, the three of you. We do want to leave you all, the participants, with those of you who came in a little bit late and didn't get to see the video. Vanessa is going to cue the video up, and we hope that you enjoyed the panel presentation. And we hope to see you in the future at more of these conversations. Have a wonderful and exciting Indigenous Peoples Day. Please take the time to acknowledge this day for yourselves, your family, and your personal and professional lives, and to think about what you personally can do to help make change in the world a better place.